There is a moment, and anyone who has loved a dog knows exactly the one, when it becomes clear that the animal isn't just a pet, it's a piece of a person's soul walking around outside their body. And when that piece disappears, they don't lose a dog. They lose a part of themselves they didn't know they needed until it was gone. This is the story of the worst 3 weeks of Martha Elaine Caldwell's life, and then the phone call that pulled her back from the edge of something she had no good word for. It wasn't grief exactly, it was more like being erased, like someone had torn pages right out of her story, and she was just walking around with a ragged hole where they used to be, reaching for words that weren't there anymore. His name was Scout. He was a border collie, and he was gone. But here's the thing that still keeps her up some nights. He came back. Not clean and simple the way you hope for. Not wrapped up easy. He came back changed, wilder, different in ways she couldn't name at first and couldn't ignore once she did. And what she had to decide after that phone call, what she had to let go of, what she had to hold on to, what she had to become, that's the story worth telling. Because some people know exactly what it feels like to love something so completely that when it changes, they're not sure whether to grieve the old version or celebrate the new one. And some people are sitting with that question right now. Not about a dog, about a person, maybe about themselves. Martha Elaine Caldwell is 67 years old, a retired schoolteacher who lives on a small farm outside of Hardwick, Vermont. She's been there 32 years, first with her husband Gerald, and after Gerald passed, just her and Scout on 11 acres of old maple and meadow. She teaches watercolor classes on Tuesday mornings at the community center in town, mostly to other retired folks who need something to do with their hands. Other than that, it's just her garden, and the mountains watching over everything like they always have. There's a question worth sitting with before going further. Have you ever loved an animal so deeply that when you looked into their eyes, you felt genuinely known? Not just seen, known. Like that creature understood something about you that most people never even tried to figure out. If the answer is yes, then you already understand everything that follows. Scout came to Martha as a 12-week-old pup in the spring of 2014. Her daughter Clara found him through a rescue out of Burlington. Some family had bought him thinking a border collie would make a fine apartment dog, which, if you know anything about the breed, makes you wince a little. They're working dogs. They need space and purpose and something to organize. Put one in an apartment and he'll reorganize your entire life, whether you asked him to or not. He arrived in a cardboard box with holes punched in the top, and when Clara lifted the flaps, Scout sat up and looked straight at Martha. Not at Clara, not at the farm stretching out behind her, at Martha. His eyes were mismatched, one blue, one brown, and there was an alertness in them that was almost unsettling in a puppy, like he'd already made a decision and was just waiting on her to catch up. She reached in and picked him up, and he tucked his chin against her collarbone and exhaled. One long, slow breath, like he'd been holding it the whole car ride. And that was it. That was the whole negotiation. That was the beginning of 9 years. He was black and white with a splash of rust above each eyebrow that made him look perpetually surprised. He weighed 11 pounds when he arrived and topped out at 52. He learned to sit in 4 days and to open the back screen door by himself in about 2 weeks, which started a brief war between them over who was actually in charge of this farm. He won, mostly, and they both knew it, and neither one of them was bothered by that arrangement. What Martha loved most about Scout was the way he worked. He had no sheep to herd, so he herded everything else. The chickens, the cats, the delivery trucks he'd watch from the fence like he was cataloging them under. requires supervision. On Sunday mornings, he'd herd Martha from the bedroom to the kitchen, as if she might genuinely get lost between the two rooms. He had a job in his mind at all times, and that job was making sure his world held its shape. He slept at the foot of her bed every night for 9 years. When Gerald died, Scout moved from the foot to the middle of the bed, and he stayed there. Some nights she'd wake up at 2 in the morning and put her hand on his back, feel the steady rise and fall of his breathing, and think, I am not alone. I am genuinely, truly not alone. There is a whole living thing that chose to be here with me, and that means something real. By the time Scout was 9, they had a rhythm between them that felt like a heartbeat. Something you stop noticing because it's just the sound of your life running the way it's supposed to run. Up before sunrise every morning, out to the meadow to check the fence line, Scout running wide circles around Martha like he was drawing a border around the whole day. Back to the house for his breakfast and her coffee, and then an hour on the porch watching the light come over the hills in that particular Vermont way, slow and gold and full of patience. Martha learned things about stillness from that dog that she never learned in 60 years of living around people. He'd lie beside her chair and press his flank against her leg, not asking for anything, not performing affection for her benefit, just maintaining contact. The way you do when you need to feel that the person beside you is still there, still real, still breathing. Gerald used to say that dogs love you the way God intended people to love each other. Without agenda, without conditions, without keeping score. Martha isn't sure she's a good enough person to love anyone that completely. But Scout was. Every single day of his life, without exception, Scout was. In the evenings they'd sit by the wood stove, him stretched across her feet like a living blanket, her reading or listening to the radio. The wind could be screaming at the eaves and the temperature dropping hard outside, and she'd look down at that dog and feel something close to perfect. Not happiness exactly, something quieter than that, something that doesn't have a clean name, but feels like the world fitting together the way it was always meant to fit. That was their life. That was what they had built together on that farm over 9 years. And Martha did not understand how fragile it was, how entirely it depended on one living creature staying where he belonged, until the Thursday in January when the blizzard came in from the north and Scout didn't come home. He'd been out in the meadow when the snow started. Martha had seen him from the kitchen window just after 2 in the afternoon, nose down in the field the way he got when he'd picked up a scent worth following. The snow was just beginning then, fat, slow flakes, the kind that look almost gentle, almost peaceful. She wasn't worried. Scout knew every inch of that land the way she knew every room in her house. By 4 o'clock the meadow had completely disappeared. The wind had turned hard from the northwest and was driving the snow sideways, and when she opened the back door and called Scout's name, the sound went nowhere. It just got swallowed whole by the white. She put on her wool coat and her heaviest boots and went out. She walked the fence line twice in the dark, stumbling through drifts that were already up to her thigh in places, her flashlight cutting a thin yellow wedge through the storm that showed her nothing useful. She called his name over and over until the word stopped sounding like a word and started sounding like something desperate and raw and animal. He wasn't there. She came in after 2 hours because she couldn't feel her feet and her flashlight battery was dying, and because she told herself he had found shelter somewhere. Border collies are smart. He'd tucked himself under a fallen tree or into the hollow of that old hemlock at the field's edge. He was warm. He was waiting it out. That's what she told herself standing in the mudroom pulling off her frozen boots. The blizzard ran for 36 hours straight. When it finally broke, there were 4 feet of snow on the ground and drifts up against the barn wall that reached the eaves. Martha was out the door before full light, following what had been the fence line by memory, calling his name into the hard, brittle cold of a Vermont morning after a storm. The silence that answered her back was the loudest thing she'd ever heard in her life. The search went on for 3 full weeks. Her neighbor Dale came out with his 2 boys the first weekend, and they walked the wood line east for 2 miles, calling, listening. The county animal shelter put out a notice. Martha drove roads she had never been on before, stopped at farms she'd never visited, knocked on doors she didn't know, and held out the photograph she kept in her coat pocket. Scout in the summer meadow, tongue out, that perpetually startled expression on his face, squinting a little into the sun. Nobody had seen him. The nights were a specific kind of awful she wouldn't wish on her worst enemy. She'd lie in bed, and the silence had a physical weight to it, a texture she could feel pressing down. That space at the foot of the bed, the place he'd slept every night for 9 years. It wasn't just empty. It was wrong in the way that a missing tooth is wrong. This absence your tongue keeps finding over and over, no matter how many times you tell yourself to stop looking for it. She'd reach down in the dark and put her hand on the quilt where he used to be, just to check. The way you do when you already know the answer, but your heart hasn't accepted it yet and keeps asking the question anyway. She called her daughter Clara every evening and tried to keep her voice steady and mostly failed. Clara offered to come and stay, and Martha told her no. She doesn't know exactly why she said no. Maybe because accepting help would have meant accepting that this was truly real and permanent, and she wasn't ready to do that. She was still bargaining with something. With the universe, with God, with just the pure stubborn refusal to believe what the evidence was telling her. Around the middle of the 2nd week, something shifted inside her. The grief stopped being sharp and cutting and started being wide and low. It spread out and went quiet, the way a high fever does when it stops burning hot and just settles in cold and steady instead. Martha held a small ceremony for Scout on a Saturday afternoon in late January. Just her alone, at the edge of the meadow where she'd last seen him. She said some things out loud that she'd been carrying inside for weeks. That he had been the finest companion she had ever known. That whatever had happened to him out there, she hoped it had been fast. She hoped it hadn't hurt. She hoped he knew, wherever he was, in whatever way animals understand such things. She hoped he knew that she had looked everywhere. She hoped he knew she didn't give up on him easily. She walked back to the house. She put his water bowl and his leash in the mudroom, in the corner behind the door, where she didn't have to walk past them every time she came in. She didn't throw them away. She just moved them out of her daily path. And then she tried to figure out who she was going to be without him. The months that followed were gray in that particular way Vermont springs can be gray. Not dramatically dark, just muted, like someone had reached in and turned the color and the volume both down a few degrees. Martha planted her garden later than usual. She walked the property less. She went into town every Tuesday for her watercolor class and was genuinely present for those 2 hours, because watching someone discover what a wet brush does on dry paper has its own small, reliable joy that doesn't depend on anything outside that room. But the farm felt enormous in a way it never had before. The house too quiet, the evenings too long, the mornings hardest of all. Some mornings she'd stand at the kitchen window with her coffee and look out at the meadow and see him there. Not a ghost, nothing strange or frightening, just the shape her mind automatically filled into a space where he had always been. A phantom made of habit and love. And then she'd blink, and the meadow would just be the meadow again. The birches coming into their thin spring green, the hills beyond them blue and patient and completely indifferent to whether she was okay. She was learning something she hadn't asked to learn. That grief is not a single event you pass through and leave behind. It's a climate, a weather system you live inside. You don't get through it into clear air on the other side. You just gradually, slowly, painfully learn how to dress for it. You learn which mornings are going to be harder, and you make your coffee a little stronger those days. You learn to be grateful for the warm days, without spending them dreading when the cold will return. Martha was in the middle of learning all of this, still figuring out who she was inside this new and unwanted life, when on a Wednesday morning in early June, 6 months and 9 days after the blizzard, her phone rang with an area code she didn't recognize. She almost let it go to voicemail. She was sitting on the porch with her coffee, and she looked at that unfamiliar number and thought unknown caller. Probably nothing. And then something. Some instinct she has since stopped trying to explain rationally made her pick it up. "Ma'am, this is Ranger Tom Phelan, calling from the Green Mountain National Forest Service station up in Lowell. I'm sorry to bother you, but I found a flyer tacked up at Tillman's feed store over in Coventry, and I'm fairly certain, actually, I might have found your dog." She stood up from her chair without deciding to stand up. Coventry is 42 miles north of her farm. 42 miles of mountain terrain and dense wilderness and stretches of country that would take a fit adult hiker multiple days to cross on foot. And somehow this animal, her 9-year-old dog, the dog she had buried in her heart 4 months ago, had traveled or been carried or simply survived across every mile of it. Ranger Phelan explained what he'd found. There was an old fire warden's cabin about 6 miles off a forest road, a structure nobody used except for emergency shelter. He'd gone out to check on it after reports of wolf activity in the area. What he found instead was a border collie, living with a small pack of eastern coyotes. 3 adults and what appeared to be 2 young ones from the previous spring. The dog was lean, but not starving. He'd clearly been integrated with this pack for a significant amount of time. He bolted when the ranger first appeared, but then came back, circled at a distance, came back again. "He's got 1 blue eye and 1 brown eye, Mom," Ranger Phelan said. Martha sat back down in her chair. Her legs had made that decision entirely without her input. "Can you bring him in?" she asked. Her voice sounded like it was coming from somewhere outside her own body. "He's not easy to approach directly, but I have a feeling he might let you get close." She was in her truck in 11 minutes flat. She drove those 42 miles in a state that can only be described as being between 2 versions of reality. Between the 6 months of believing he was gone forever and whatever truth was waiting at the other end of that road. Her hands on the wheel, the mountain highway winding north through the June hills, everything outside the windows so green it almost hurt to look at, and her barely seeing any of it. Ranger Phelan met her at the Forest Road turnoff and drove her in his truck the rest of the way. They parked and walked the last quarter mile through old pine forest, the ground soft underfoot, the air smelling of resin and cold water somewhere nearby. And then she saw him. He was standing at the tree line, maybe 40 feet from where they stopped, thinner than she remembered, not badly, but noticeably. His coat longer and matted in places, carrying the evidence of months lived outdoors. He was holding himself differently too, lower to the ground, more compact and careful, the way a wild animal holds itself when it isn't sure whether to stay or run. But that particular face, those two different, colored eyes looking straight at her. Scout, she said, quietly. Just his name, nothing else. He froze completely. Scout. He took one careful step toward her and then stopped. His whole body was vibrating with something she recognized as the collision of two different lives happening inside one animal at the same moment. The wild life and the home life, the pack and the person, both of them real, both of them his. She sat down on the ground right there, in the pine needles and the mud and whatever else was on that forest floor. She sat down like a child and held out both hands, palms up and open, and she waited. It took 4 minutes. Ranger Philin told her that afterward, because he was watching his watch. To Martha, sitting there on the cold ground with her hands open, it felt like an entire season passing slowly overhead. Scout came to her in small, careful increments, a few steps, then a pause, a long reading of the air between them, another few steps, another pause, and then something broke open in him, and he closed the last of the distance in a rush and drove his head into her chest so hard it knocked her backward, and she wrapped both arms around him and pressed her face into that wild, matted, unrecognizable, smelling fur. And she made sounds she could not have described to you if you'd asked her to try. He smelled like pine resin and creek water and earth and something else beneath all of that, something she'd never smelled on him before. He smelled like himself and also like somewhere she had never been and would never go. He smelled like his whole other life. Scout came home with Martha that same day. He ate a full bowl of food and drank a long drink of water, and she sat on the kitchen floor beside him and just watched him like he might disappear again if she looked away. For those first few hours, everything felt like grace. But by nightfall, she could see what she was actually dealing with. He paced. He stood at the back door for long stretches, nose working, eyes fixed on the dark outside with an intensity she had never seen in him before. He didn't come to the bedroom. He didn't sleep at the foot of her bed or in the middle of it. He curled up against the back door and stayed there all night. And in the morning, when she came out, he was already awake, already watching the yard. He still knew her. That needs to be very clear. He followed her through the rooms of the house. He lay beside her chair in the evenings. He still pressed his flank against her leg when they stood together at the porch railing. The thread between them had not broken, but something had been added to him that she hadn't put there, and it lived in his body and his instincts in a way that was not going to leave. He had learned a different kind of belonging out there. Not belonging to a person, but belonging to a place and a pack, and the serious, unsentimental business of survival. That knowledge was part of him now. He was not the scout who had walked into that blizzard. For a while Martha grieved that. Genuinely grieved it, the way you grieve a real loss. She missed the dog who had slept at her feet and herded her to the kitchen and exhaled against her collarbone, like he'd finally arrived somewhere safe. That dog was gone as completely as if he'd never come back at all. And she had to sit with that truth and decide what to do with it. What she arrived at eventually, slowly, through many early mornings and cups of coffee and long quiet walks, was this: Scout had not been diminished by what happened to him. He had been expanded by it. Those 6 months in the wilderness hadn't taken him away from himself. They had added to himself, layered something onto him that ran deep and would stay. He was her dog, and he was also something far beyond her dog. Something she hadn't made and couldn't have imagined. And her job now wasn't to mourn the parts that had changed. Her job was to make enough room inside herself to love what he had actually become. She moved his bed to the back door where he wanted to sleep. She stopped expecting him to follow the old routines. She started taking him out earlier in the mornings, when the farm was still half dark and the smells were rising clean and strong from the ground. And she let him range further than she ever used to, let him follow his nose all the way into the tree line, while she stood at the edge of the meadow and waited. Some mornings he'd stand just inside the trees for a long minute, ears up, reading something in the air that she would never in her life be able to read. Something from that other world, that other life, calling to whatever part of him still belonged to it. And then he'd turn around and come back across the meadow to her. Every single morning, without fail, he always came back. Scout is 11 years old now. His muzzle has gone completely silver, and he moves through the mornings more carefully than he used to, feeling his way into the cold a little more slowly. But his eyes are the same as the day he arrived in that cardboard box. Mismatched, alert, watching everything around him with that quality of attention that always made Martha feel like the world was being properly looked after. He sleeps by the back door. He wakes before she does. On the coldest winter mornings, he walks close against her leg when they go out together to check the fence line, and she thinks about how much has happened to them both. How much ground they've covered since that 12-week-old puppy pressed his chin against her collarbone and exhaled. What Scout's disappearance taught Martha, and what his return confirmed in a way she couldn't have expected, is that love is not a museum piece. You cannot put the thing you love behind glass and expect it to stay exactly as it was the day you fell in love with it. People change. Animals change. Circumstances reach into your life and change everything. And the love that survives is never the love that refused to bend. It's always the love that found a way to bend without breaking. She had to make a choice when Scout came home. She could spend her energy grieving who he used to be, holding his changed self up against the memory of his old self and finding it lacking. Or she could open her arms to what was actually standing in front of her. This wilder, deeper, more layered creature who had survived things she couldn't imagine and still found his way back to her kitchen floor. She chose the opening. And what she got in exchange for letting go of the old Scout was something she didn't know she needed. That moment every single morning at the edge of the trees, when he stands and reads the wild air and then turns around and walks back to her. That choice he makes, that daily, voluntary, completely unhurried choice to come home. That is the whole of it, isn't it? Love that chooses you every day when it has other options. Love that comes back not because it has to, but because something in it still wants to. That's the only kind that means anything. Gerald showed her that. And then Gerald was gone. And then Scout showed her that. And then Scout was gone too. And then Scout came back and showed her again, more completely and more wildly and more blessedly than the first time. She doesn't know how much longer she'll have him. She knows 11 is getting on for a border collie, and she knows that morning is out there somewhere, the one where she goes to the back door and he isn't there to meet her. She knows it's coming, and she has decided not to spend these mornings dreading it. She has decided to spend them here, in this one, her hand on his back, feeling him breathe, watching the light come over the hills the way it has been coming over those hills since long before either of them arrived, and will keep coming long after they're both gone. Be here. Love the ones who come back to you. Let them be changed. Let yourself be changed by the returning. That is not a loss. That is the whole gift. That is perhaps the one true thing a person can spend a lifetime learning. And sometimes it takes losing your dog in a blizzard and getting him back from the wilderness to finally understand it all the way down. Two questions worth sitting with, and real answers are worth leaving in the comments. because stories like Martha's get read, and sometimes what one person writes is exactly what someone else scrolling through needs to find. First, has an animal ever truly changed you? Not just kept you company through a hard time, but actually shifted something in you, changed the way you see yourself or the world. And second, have you ever had to love someone as they were, instead of as they used to be? Did you find a way to do it? And what did that cost you? And what did it give you back? If this story touched something real, hit that subscribe button, because every single week brings a new story just like this one. True stories about the bond between people and animals, about love and loss, and the kind of loyalty that doesn't ask for anything in return. Stories about what it means to be human and to love something with your whole heart. Scout is at the back door. The morning is waiting.